This is Ed Rep Radio, presented by Eastman Music Company. This is Ed Rep Radio, a podcast to bring you ideas and information from industry experts you can use on the road every day. Presented by Eastman Music Company, and I'm your host, Shane Duell. Today we'll be talking about the world of flutes with Korinne Smith, sales manager with the William S. Haynes Flute Company. I don't know about you, but as an Ed Rep, I found working with flutes and flute players was more complex than working with other instruments. Korinne will help us understand some of the history of the flute and flute making, important details that Ed Reps should know about flutes themselves and some of the popular options that come on the flute, and how to work best with flute customers. Korinne, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Shane. It's great to be here.
So, as I do with all the guests on Ed Rep Radio, I first like to get to know who it is you are and how you got to be where you are in the music industry. Can you kind of walk us through your career and how you got to be at Haynes?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Well, my name is Korinne Smith. I am the sales manager of the William S. Haynes Flute Company. I've been in this position for almost 2 years now. Prior to that, I worked as the regional sales manager for the Northeast for Eastman Music Company, the parent company of the William S. Haynes Flute Company. I have my degrees in music education and my graduate degrees in flute performance.
Okay.
Many years of graduate degrees in flute performance.
Yeah.
But
What schools did you go to?
I went to Nazareth College in Rochester, New York, which is where I reside now for my undergrad in music ed. And then I did a master's and doctorate in flute performance and pedagogy from the University of South Carolina.
Okay. Did you ever see yourself when you were going through school to be a flute performer to end up in the music industry?
Not at all, Shane. Not one bit.
I think a lot of us feel that way. We have ed degrees or performance degrees, and somehow we got into the industry. And looking back, it's a lot of people say that they didn't see it coming. But how do you enjoy it?
I love it. And I'm actually a huge advocate of making sure that colleges do know about this opportunity because we weren't told about it when we were in school, right? And we didn't think about it as an offering. And it is, I would never go back, honestly. I will not be leaving this music industry, hopefully, if I'm gainfully employed for a while. I think Eastman will keep me on.
I think so. We're lucky to have you.
Thank you. It's the best job in the world. And I'm lucky every day to wake up and be a part of this wonderful family. So
That's awesome. So what do you do at Haynes?
So I am the sales manager. I do a variety of different things, from working with our artists, our young artists, working with our amazing dealers that carry our Amadeus, our Q series, and our custom flutes, and scheduling events, doing all the marketing, and working with a wonderful team at Haynes, on the sales side as well as the production team. And my job entitles a lot of different components.
I'm just curious, before Haynes, when you were becoming a performer, were you also a teacher?
I was, yes.
Okay. Okay. And you had a studio.
Yes, a studio of probably over 30 students, and they range from.
Wow.
Yeah, I had a small kinder flute program that I started in South Carolina, and that I think the youngest I taught was 4 years old, all the way up to I think my oldest student was about 85.
What?
Yeah, I had a senior adult amateur flute choir called the Flute Loops, and I really enjoyed working with them. So yeah, I've taught every age group. I also worked at adjunct professor at several colleges in the area, and yeah, so I do miss teaching quite a bit, but there's a lot of those skill sets that I acquired from that translate into the position today. So very grateful.
Okay. What a varied experience you have in the world of flute. So you're the perfect person to talk to about flutes and flute people. Coming as a trumpet player, I always found flutists were a different kind of customer to work with versus a violinist or a trumpet player or a trombone player. There was something different about flutists in their background and the way they looked at the instruments and the way they worked with each other as fellow flutists that I want to help ed reps out there in the field get to know not just the equipment better, but also what makes flute players tick? What makes them think the way they do and the way they approach their instruments?
Sure.
So I'd like to start kind of with a little history of the flute itself. I feel like, given the fact that Haynes is the world's oldest flute maker, we should probably start there.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, well, the flute is one of the first instruments that was ever created, Shane. So it was the drum and then it was
Hmm.
the flute, right? So I don't know if we want to go into too much history of the
Well,
actual
6 million
instrument,
years ago.
right? but but the William S. Haynes Flute Company, you're right, is the oldest flute manufacturer in the United States. And so we have been making flutes for gosh, like 133 years now.
Wow.
And yeah, for the majority of that time, Haynes was known for their custom level instruments, meaning these were instruments made for the professionals playing in major symphony orchestras, major teachers. And so a very high profile of a player. But it wasn't until, 2004 when owner of Eastman Music Company, Chen Ni, acquired the company and set out on his vision to create a Haynes for every player, student, aspiring, professional, and professional. So yeah, that's a little bit of history, and
Okay.
yeah.
So Haynes is in just outside of Boston. It actually started in Boston, right?
Yes, flute making comes from the jewelry making industry. And because of that, all the flute makers, the American flute makers, started in downtown Boston in the jewelry making district. So we have since moved out of that area, and so have all the other makers to go outside
Hmm.
of Boston. It's just too expensive to be right in
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
downtown. So now we're out in Acton, Massachusetts, about an hour northwest outside.
Okay. Okay.
Mhm.
So Haynes was the first flute maker in Boston, and then obviously they're not the only flute maker in Boston. Are they related somehow?
Yes. So there are also several other makers, and they all kind of aspire for this American flute sound, um, of
Hmm.
which of which the Haynes Company, which it all comes back to the Haynes Company, William and George Haynes, and they made several different instruments when they first started off, but they settled on making flutes. And William S.
Hmm.
Haynes, George ended up leaving at one point, and it was just William's company, and so when anybody picks up a Haynes or has heard about the Haynes Flute Company, I think the first thing that anybody talks about is the sound. And that is the genesis of the American sound.
Hmm.
And that American sound does come from a lineage from the French flute sound. And that is the sound that comes from the Paris Conservatory. And I don't want to talk too much in regard to sound because it's relative to every person, right?
Hmm.
People talk about sound differently. But for the Haynes sound and for the American sound, it's quite robust. It's in my opinion, it is a sound that can be heard across an orchestra into the back of the hall.
Hmm.
And it's one that is very unique, has a lot of depth, a lot of different colors. It's interesting to listen to. And so for that, those colors and the variety of sound that you can create, I think that is what, if you are that type of player and musician that is wanting to explore all these possibilities, the Haynes flute and the American sound is what you should look for.
Okay. So there's the American sound, and just for general knowledge, you have Haynes that started it all, and then you had Powell, and then there's Brannon. There's others out there. Who am I missing in
Oh,
Boston area?
so you've got so the other yep, we've got Powell, Brannon, Burkhart. Those are kind of the major American flute makers there, and then you have some smaller flute makers. Emmanuel Rista, they kind of just make higher end, just the professional level flutes, the custom
Okay.
handmade flutes. But yes, yep, they all come from Boston, and I would say we're all relatively good friends, right? We all know each other very well. It's a small industry, and we're all aspiring for the same thing, right? Is to really make these wonderful flutes and to have this sound accessible to all. So,
Hmm. Yeah, that's great.
mhm.
That's one thing I love about the industry.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm curious. I've heard about the American sound, but there's also the Japanese sound,
Mhm.
and there are all sorts of different Japanese makers. If you're a flutist and you try a Japanese flute versus an American flute, what are you feeling? What are you hearing different between the two?
Again, when we talk about sound and everybody's experiences of different brands of flutes, it's going to be different based on the player. But I'll tell you my experience of this, and I'll be open as to what flutes I play, if that's okay, and all the different
Sure.
brands and how I've
Sure.
come to
Totally.
Haynes. So I started. Let me see. My first flute was an Armstrong flute, which American-made flute, right?
Yeah. Classic.
Yeah, classic, and it was a really great student flute. I didn't know what it meant to have an American flute sound at the time. I was just learning my instrument, learning how to play. And then as I
Hmm.
became more serious, my mother said, let's go to a flute shop. And we asked our teacher, where should we go? And they recommended that we go to a specialty flute shop. So that's something to really note, right? I was studying, taking private flute lessons, and that private flute teacher was recommending that I go to a specialist.
Mm.
And so we went to, at the time it was Flute World in Michigan. I'm from Buffalo, New York originally. And so we drove across the border into Canada and down to Detroit, and we went to Flute World, and my teacher wasn't able to come with me, but I just put her on the speakerphone, and I tried out a bunch of different flutes there at Flute World, and I settled on a Powell Conservatory, which is a professional model. It's kind of their entry level custom flute, handmade flute, and that kept me on. I kept that flute from my undergrad, master's, and into my doctorate. So it kept me through a lot of got me through a lot of years of playing. Throughout that time, I switched out on various head joints, which we can talk more thoroughly about. But the majority of the sound of all flutes comes from the head joint. And so, what flutists like to do is change out the head joint every once in a while,
Mm.
to explore more possibilities in their sound. It's also a great way, to change your sound, but not have to pay for an entirely new flute. This is more, again, at the stage of my life where I was becoming a professional. And when I finished with my doctorate, I finally said, okay, I've been doing this head joint changing out here and there, but this flute is really seeing its day. It's time for me to make a change. And I'm kind of one of those buyers that when I see something and I feel something immediately and that feels good, sounds good, I buy it. I don't really wait too long. And so at the time I was in South Carolina, and JL Smith at the time, they sent me a few trials, and they had me, I ended up trying a Yamaha custom, which honestly, in the flute world, Yamaha is not known for their custom level instruments. They're known for their student level instruments, and they're really, really good. They're really, really good quality, right? They're
Hmm.
consistent, they're stable. And that's exactly what I felt when I picked up that custom Yamaha. It responded immediately. The scale was good, it was very in tune. It was kind of like a semi truck. I was playing a semi truck. It was a huge sound, huge
Hmm.
sound. And so immediately I was like, this feels good. It plays good. I'm buying it. And so I
Hmm.
bought myself that gift. That was in, let's see, that was May of 2015.
Okay. Now that's interesting. You went from an American-made flute in the Powell, and you went to a
Exactly.
Japanese flute in
Yeah.
Yamaha.
Yeah. And I think it was because it was easy, it was responsive.
Hmm. Okay.
After a couple months of playing on that flute, I said, this isn't my flute. This isn't my sound. It was a good sound. It was a solid flute, but it
Hmm.
wasn't me. And I was missing those colors. I was missing the depth. I was missing my voice. And I couldn't do that on on the Yamaha. So I started changing out head joints, which helped a little bit, but ultimately it still didn't feel like it was my flute.
Hmm.
So then I got the job with Eastman a couple months later. At the time, honestly, I hadn't had a lot of exposure to Haynes.
Hmm.
Um, and so I started playing them, trying them out. And I took a long time to decide on purchasing my instrument, because I said, well, I don't really play that much anymore. You go into the industry, and I was also having a growing family at the time. And I said, and I was traveling a lot, as we do as road reps, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And I had to put the instrument down and focus on my family and focus on my work. So I just said, I'm not going to buy right now. I have Q series and Amadeus flutes at my disposal if I need to play a church gig or
Right.
something like that. So I got to know those level of instruments of Amadeus and Q, and I loved playing them as a professional, playing on a
Hmm.
Q2 with a 14 karat riser. did everything that I needed it to do, and I could still have my voice.
That's about a
Um,
$5,000 flute right there.
that's exactly right. Yeah, that's all I
Yeah.
needed. And so then it came around time to when I was ready, and finances, life in general, things are a little bit more stable as you transition from out of being a student to into the real world. I started saying, okay, now it's time for me to buy my new flute. And so I've gone through and tried all the various options in the Haynes custom line, and I've settled on my flute, and it is being made. It should be done in the next month or so. So I'm extremely excited about it. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, again, with Haynes, the Haynes sound, it challenges me, right? It's not. I would say for me personally, it's not something that comes immediately.
Hmm.
It is a sound that. Not saying that they're not responsive, because they are responsive. It's just when I first make a sound, I'm like, ooh, there's more to that. What more can I find in this? And it challenges me, and it makes me question what more is possible as me
Hmm.
as an artist, but also in this with this flute. What is possible here? So it's really exciting every day for me to pick up that instrument, and it's every day's a new adventure. So that's what I love about the Haynes flutes and the American sound.
So I'd like to dig into the actual flutes themselves and how they're made, what they're made of, and all the details there. And since ed reps spend so much time renting beginning level flutes, let's start there. So talk us through what they're made of first. What materials are going into this instrument?
Yeah, so student level flutes are made of nickel silver, and body, the tubing, the mechanism, nickel silver, and then it's silver plated.
Okay.
So, and they're all, student level flutes are going to be closed hold instruments with a C foot,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
with also a nickel silver riser. And those materials used are so that it's as durable as possible, right? As a student, you're
Mm-hmm.
going to
Mm-hmm.
be knocking it around, and it creates an okay sound. It does what it needs to do to get the sound immediately. It's responsive. That's if the head joint cut is cut the right way. So not all head
Okay.
joint
Yeah.
cuts are the same.
Yeah. We'll get into that.
We can
Yeah.
get into that for sure. But really basic materials that keep the costs down, but also starts the student on the right foot in music making.
Okay. So one of the most obvious differences between a student flute, or as a lot of people call it, a beginner flute, and a nicer flute, a step-up flute, is student flutes have closed holes, and the nicer flutes, above $1,000 typically, have open holes. Why does that happen?
Yeah. So honestly, open holes are a bit too difficult for students to deal with. You would probably say, well, a clarinetist does it, but it's just a little
Hmm.
different. The hand position is very tricky on the flute, especially when you kind of dig into how you hold the flute. You actually only balance it in three places. And those three places are under your lip, right? Your chin, that's number one.
Hmm.
Number two is your left hand index finger on the edge, and your right thumb. And
Hmm.
it's very, very wobbly. It's very difficult to
Yeah.
actually have a really good balance of the flute, right? Where a clarinet, it's much more even, much more balanced. The clarinet's right in front of you. So with that, we don't want to make it any more difficult for the student by opening up the holes. And traditionally, Haynes custom flutes were closed hole. Professional level
I-
instruments were closed hole.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, you know, you could ask the makers this. I ask them this several times throughout the years. I'm like, are you sure there's really not a sound difference between open hole and closed hole? And they're like, Corinne, no, there's really not. So it
Interesting.
is really interesting. So, the open hole is to do, a variety of different things. At first, number one, aesthetically, looks a little more professional. It looks a little bit more elegant.
Hmm.
It is kind of, again, just this traditional lineage that when you get to a certain level, you're going to go with open hole. And that's mostly because of the literature as well. And especially the new age literature, the music that's written today requires a lot of extended techniques. And so you're able to do, glissandos and half holing because you have an open hole instrument.
Okay.
Now, sound wise, again, people will say that there's not a huge difference. Some people say that there is. But when it comes to educating, pedagogy, you really want to focus on correct hand position. And in the beginning, we want to keep them having students, beginners, closed hole instruments. So they're focusing on the balancing the flute and making sure that they're having a good sound and not being worried so much on the hand position. Next step is hand position. And so those open holes will really, really be telling if you have your hands in the right position and your
Mm-hmm.
fingers, being in this ergonomic way. So yeah, that's why we wait to do the open holes till later.
Okay. So hand position is so crucial. We have to put plugs in the cases, right, to allow students to actually be able to play these open holes.
That's
Can you talk
correct.
talk about the plugs a little bit and maybe the best way to think about those and how to use them?
Oh, absolutely. So I'm just thinking because we're talking to the majority of our audience today, our ed reps, right? So making sure, like, when you're introducing an open hole flute to a student that has a beginner flute, making sure you keep all those plugs in, keep it
Mm,
consistent, keep it to let them focus on the sound that they're wanting rather than trying to play the flute with open holes. Leave that to the teacher. So
mm.
you can also say, if you have a student that has been kind of working on going to open holes, keep the plugs in and take out maybe one at a time. It's a
Okay.
long process. So I would really recommend making sure the plugs are in the case, they're in that little Ziploc baggie,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, and you might want to keep a lot of those extras on hand because they do get lost pretty easily. So,
Oh yeah. Yeah, you drop one, they go flying across the room and you'll never
ex-
see it again. So yeah, good tip on extra plugs with you.
yeah, exactly.
So closed hole, open hole between beginning and we'll call them performance level flutes. So let's look at the material. So you have nickel silver
Hmm.
in the beginning level flutes,
Yep,
which is kind of a trick term, isn't it? I mean, nickel silver, it doesn't actually have any silver in it. It's nickel, copper, and zinc
that's right.
plated in silver.
Yep.
So what do you get when you go up in price level? What's the difference between that nickel silver beginning flute and these performance flutes?
Sure. So you're going to have more solid silver, sterling silver content.
Okay.
So I'm just thinking about with our Amadeus line of flutes, right, which are performance level instruments.
Hmm.
We have the 580. So our first, what we do, kind of something special with that model, in that the majority of flute manufacturers, they go right to upgrading to a sterling silver head joint. We make it a little bit more affordable for the students that maybe just want a little better sounding instrument and don't want to pay the price of a sterling silver head joint or body. And we upgrade the riser, the what we call the wall. Those terms are interchangeable: riser and wall. And so, what does the riser and wall do? Would be the next question. What part of the flute is that? Right? It's not
Right.
the
What's a riser?
right. So the riser, or the wall, is the material that is in between the lip plate and the head joint tube, and that's what solders the lip plate and tube together.
Hmm. Okay.
That little piece of metal is where the majority of the air hits when you're playing the flute, and it bounces off and goes into the flute or escapes, right? So that is where the air column hits that piece of metal. And so what that metal is made out of, the material, is what makes the whole difference in the sound.
Huh. Just that
Um,
little piece.
that little piece, yeah. So for the Amadeus 580, that's our first level performance level flute. We upgrade the riser and the lip plate as well. And then when we get to the 680, that's where we make a sterling silver tube. The head joint tube is sterling silver.
Okay. I just want to pause right there. The term sterling silver, you hear that a lot. It's sterling silver. Can you tell us what in the world sterling silver really is?
Yeah, so sterling silver is just an alloy of silver. So it actually contains 92.5% of silver. And then the
Okay.
7.5% is other metals, but mostly copper.
Okay.
So it is an alloy. Coin silver is what we make our custom flutes out of. And you'll be surprised to know that coin silver is actually 90% silver and 10% copper.
Interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So sterling silver is 92.5% silver.
Okay. So obviously a lot more silver real solid silver is in actual sterling silver versus nickel silver,
Yeah.
since there's zero silver in nickel silver. So how does that affect the sound? Let's just look at when you have just that head joint, like you mentioned in the 680.
Yeah.
How does that affect the sound?
Again, I just want to preface this that everybody talks about sound a little bit differently, but I will kind of
Sure.
categorize it for you. Sterling silver, it just makes the sound, again, it helps it. Remember, I was talking about how the Haynes sound, you can hear it across an orchestra into the back of the hall.
Yeah.
Very similar here. When you change the material to a sterling silver, you're going to have more projection, and you're going to have more like a little bit more response. There's going to be more depth of sound, more color. Student level flute sound is very dull. When you get to having more silver content, it is a little bit brighter, more silvery, glittery, I guess would be what I would use.
So when you look at a lot of makers, you have a progression of more and more silver going into higher and higher models. And obviously you're paying the price difference for that. So as you add more silver content to the flute, you have, you mentioned with the 5.8, it just has the solid silver riser and lip plate. The 680 had solid silver head joint. Now I know our 780 has our solid silver body as well. What do you get as you're adding more and more silver and other than paying more?
Yeah. So it's all about the sound, right? The more silver, it can be, again, just more projection. That's how I foresee it. There's more
Okay.
possibilities. There's more opportunities for character changes, colors, all the different varieties of sound. So there's just more opportunity there with that
I
silver.
see. Okay. So you talked a bit about the foot joint, and if you look at a student flute, you have a shorter foot joint, and then on a performance flute, you have a longer foot joint. Why does that happen?
Yeah, because we're having an extension going from the low C to a low B. So we're adding a whole nother note to the instrument, right? It's going down a half step. So we're extending the range of the instrument. And, some educators be like, what's the point of that? Like, we hardly, you hardly play a low B or see that in any band literature or orchestra literature. Well, that's not true. I remember in 8th grade, I forget who the composer is, and all the band directors will be laughing at me, but I remember
Hmm.
this piece called Inchan, and it was an opening flute solo in the beginning, and it had a low B. And I was in I think 7th or 8th grade. It was our 7th and 8th grade band, and luckily I had, a performance level instrument that had a low B. But
Hmm.
boy, that was difficult to get out, especially for, the first few measures were just me, flute solo alone with some drums in the background. So it extends, down a half step. It also is helpful for some intonation in the third octave. So it adds a little bit more weight. Any type of weight is going to make a difference in the sound to the flute. So it's allowing for another note to be added, some intonation help in the third octave, and some extended techniques later on as well. You'll look at Europe and other places of the world where they don't really believe in the B foot. It's not needed.
Hmm.
But here in the US,
Interesting.
that is a very common, like, we go right to B foot when we upgrade our flute. So,
Right. Right. Okay.
yes.
So another difference you hear about between student flutes and performance flutes is the embouchure hole in the head joint.
Mhm.
I've heard they're quite different between the two levels of flute. Can you talk us first of all about, I guess, our approach as a maker in a beginning level flute, how we create that embouchure hole, and what is an embouchure hole?
Yeah, so the embouchure hole is actually the cut in the lip plate and riser. So again, we were talking about how is a head joint made, and I'm going to have real simplistic terms here. If you want to, have our master head joint maker and general manager Ava O'Leary talk more about head joints, you should invite her on.
Sure,
But
that's a
but
whole nother episode.
it is. But head joints are actually really really simple. There's only three parts to it, right? The head joint tube, like I said, the riser, and the lip plate. And so the head joint cut that we're talking about is the lip plate and the riser. And so those are soldered together, and then head joint makers, do their magic, and they create a head joint cut based on the player that they're wanting to fit to, I guess. And so for student level flutes, the head joint cut that they're choosing obviously is for absolute beginners, which is really open and very responsive, almost immediate, right? So they're
Hmm.
successful on that first note and they don't get discouraged and give up. But because of the availability of that sound, right? The accessibility, there's always going to be a compromise. So you're
Hmm.
not going to have as much depth. You're not going to have as much brilliance or as many color options because the cut is made for the purpose of accessibility and immediate response. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah. So is it easy for a
E-
beginner then?
I mean, it should be. That's the hope, right?
That's the idea. Yeah.
That's the idea. Yeah.
So when you're a beginner and you've played for a little while, this head joint cut you were talking about, it's fairly easy, accessible. When do you know as a player that you're beyond this beginning instrument now?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Shane. You're going to start to feel uncomfortable, like kind of
Hmm.
when you start outgrowing your clothes or shoes, right? You're like, ooh,
Hmm.
I'm not getting what I want out of this. And you may even be like, when you grow out of a shoe, you might feel really tight. You might feel like, or you might be overblowing it, right? Your toe might start sticking out of the end. um, you have more air and you have more support, and the flute can't keep up with you. And
Hmm.
again, maybe you can't create all the colors that you're wanting to because you're a budding musician and you're discovering other possibilities. And you're just not loving the sound that's coming out of it. But for the most part, if they're overblowing, if they're cracking, and they do have a good embouchure, maybe they're studying with a private teacher, like they have good instruction, that might be a time where you're like, okay, it's time for you to upgrade. Let's look at some other head joint possibilities. And that's when we get into some more, some different options for head joint cuts. So when you look at, like, for example, the Amadeus line, there are two head joint options there. We have the
Hmm.
Amadeus head joint cut that comes standard with the Amadeus flutes. That head joint cut was made purposefully for that transition to be extremely easy, going from the student head joint cut to a performance level, another head joint cut, right? And then we also offer the classic head joint cut, and it's the same exact price as the Amadeus. We could switch it out. That's why we want to have two options. And the classic head joint cut is just a little, I will actually say, if you were to put them side by side, classic is a little bit more square.
Okay.
And if you were to look at the Amadeus, it's a little bit more oval. So if you look at your student head joint, more than likely it's going to be a bit more oval or round in shape, especially compared to the classic head joint. The classic head joint gives a little bit, for me, and this is how I'm going to speak to it, a little bit more resistance, which means you have to have some air support. You have to know exactly how to direct that air column into the flute, or else you're not going to be able to make a very good sound on it.
Hmm.
So you have to have a certain set of skills to really get what you want out of that head joint. That's why we have both options, the Amadeus and the classic, because you're in front of a student and they're trying all these different flutes, that you can say, here, you really like the Amadeus? Well, here, make sure you try this head joint cut and find out which one really fits, because every player is going to be a little bit different.
It's very
But
personal, isn't it?
it is very personal, and we like to make it that way. So,
We'll get into the flutist mindset in a little bit here.
sure.
So we've talked about materials in beginning flutes and foot joints and embouchure holes and things like that. Um, there are other things that you can add to a performance level flute you don't find on a basic student flute. What are some of the most popular options that we would typically put on to a performance level flute that better players would ask for?
Sure. So, well, we would offer a C sharp trill. I'm going to go with that because you said better level players. When we talk about the splitty, that's really just a preference. It doesn't matter if they're really, great players like at a professional level, or if they're, just stepping into the performance level instruments. But let's talk about C sharp trill first. So C sharp trill is something that can give you an ease of playing when you're playing B to C sharp. So
Okay.
the fingering for B is left hand thumb and first finger, right? The index finger on the left hand. And again, this is going back to kind of the balance of the flute that we talked about in the beginning.
Hmm.
It's tricky, right? If they don't have a really good sense of balance and holding that flute, going from B to C sharp, which is completely open, you're taking off that left hand thumb, you're taking off the left hand index finger, and you're just holding the flute with your right hand thumb, your chin, and your left index finger. Your pinky, your right hand pinky key is down as well. But it's very unstable and it's very tricky
Hmm.
to trill fast between the B and C sharp. You have to have a very secure setup. And so it's a good teachable moment, right? For the teacher to be like, okay, this is really showing us that you need to work on this. But the C sharp trill is helpful in that you can push the B down and then keep it down, and then with your right hand index finger trill the C sharp key that is just right next to it, and you can trill it a lot faster as well. So it's more comfortable, but it's also able to again accessible to play it at a faster speed.
Hmm. And it sounds like way less awkward to do
Yes.
that trill with that little extra button, right?
Exactly. Yep,
Okay.
a lot less
Yeah.
awkward.
All right. Is that, you think, one of the more popular or important options to add to a flute if you're adding options?
Yeah, I think, the trend is today to kind of get every option that you can. Like, it's like having a car with all the bells and whistles, right?
Hmm.
I feel like the market is going in this place of like, I want my best bang for my buck and I want all the options possible. So why not we make that available to, these professional level options, right? That used to only be on the custom flutes. Let's make them available to younger players, or be more beginner players, intermediate players. So we also have on there the split E option or the G disc. High E on the flute is very difficult to produce, and so the split E helps with the production of that note.
Okay. So the split E, it looks like it's part of the keywork, right?
Yes, it is part of the keyword.
Okay. And so there's these other things that we can do with flute making and adding things on to help this, what sounds like a really difficult note, the high E. There's
Mhm.
what other additions can we put onto the flute to help with that high E?
Yeah, so the split E mechanism, like we said, it's a part of, we're not adding anything onto it. That would be the G disc mechanism, which I'll talk about in a second. But the split E is when we press down one key, a partner key also is pressed down at the same time. So it allows for a pair of keys to function separately from its partner. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Hmm.
The G disc or the high E facilitator. Again, we have various names for this. It's or the donut, right? Is
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
that
I've heard they called that too. Hmm.
yeah, that is added onto the flute in the G key, in the G tone hole. And so that can be added at any time. But that also serves the same purpose. It's for that production of that E that can be very tricky to
Hmm.
play.
So what if you don't have a split E or a G disc slash high
Mhm,
E facilitator slash donut?
mhm.
What do you do?
Well, you learn how to create it. Actually, I never had a split E or a G disc, so I had to
Hmm.
learn how to make sure I don't crack my E's. And I did that through knowing exactly where that E lives on the flute, knowing exactly where my air direction needs to be, know exactly how open my embouchure, how open my throat needed to be, so that when I went to play an E, it just automatically played, and I didn't struggle too much with it. But I'm telling you, Shane, it takes years to really
Hmm.
be able to hone in on that. So the split E and the G disc really do help make it a little bit easier.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you hear a lot of times with flutes, you have different materials that are being used outside of sterling silver. You have gold and all these other fancy materials. Can you talk about some of the more common materials that you'll find in the flutes?
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked a lot about when we're upgrading our flute from a sterling silver head joint to sterling silver body. Um, it even goes a step up from there to a sterling silver mechanism as well. So the entire flute
Hmm.
is then sterling silver. You can also change, at that point we're now talking about the Q series range of instruments on the Haynes side of things.
Yeah.
But we're looking at, white gold springs. That's going to make a difference.
Hmm.
Also, you have, before we get to changing out the materials completely, let's start with just the riser, changing the materials of that riser or wall. We talked about
Okay.
before the riser and wall making a huge difference in terms of the sound. That's where the air hits first and bounces off. And so when you get to the Amadeus offers this as well as the Q series flutes, but you can have a 14 karat gold, rose gold riser. And
Hmm.
I would say for the majority of flutists, gold really warms up the sound. Again, creates just a few different variances in color and timbre. And I always recommend that flutists try the classic head joint with a 14K wall. It makes a huge difference in sound. And reps that are not flute players can tell the difference, and parents that are not musicians can definitely hear the difference. When I'm having a student try those two, it's a huge difference in sound.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
highly recommend that.
Okay.
Also,
Even
yeah,
that
go ahead.
little riser will,
Yeah.
if it's gold, changes it. That's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And then again, you can start experimenting and exploring different materials in the head joint, right? So we have all 14K gold head joints. We have 10 karat
Hmm.
gold head joints. We have 19.5 karat gold head joints. That's in the custom line. But when you're looking at like Q series, we offer a fusion material, which is 9K tube fused with a sterling silver tube,
Hmm.
which is a really unique blend and has a wonderful sound, all the aspects of silver and gold combined. So that can also be made into a full flute as well. So we do offer a Q series fusion flute. Again, you're getting closer to that the $9,000-$10,000 range at that point. But as you get higher, in your playability and your studies, your music making, but also able to, financially support that, you have more options in regards to material. Some other options that we have, I think we said all the carats, the 10K, the 9K, the 10K, the 14K. We also offer 14K white gold as well,
Hmm.
which is the flute I'm buying. I'm super excited. um,
Nice.
so there's 14K white, gold, and rose, and 19.5, and then we also even offer platinum, um, which is
Wow.
price upon request because that price is changing constantly. But yeah, the options are significant when you're getting to the custom range of flutes.
Yeah, sounds like it.
Hmm.
Which brings us kind of into price ranges in general for
Yeah,
flutes, which is an entirely different set of price ranges from, say, a trumpet.
yeah,
So I'd like to kind of walk through, I guess, from level of player to appropriate level of price range, if you know what I mean. Like, so
sure.
let's start with those customs that you were talking about with the gold and the platinum and all these really amazing, beautiful materials. What price range are these custom flutes in, and who would buy one in that price range? Who would need one?
Yeah. Well, in today's market, I mean, I know we're all experiencing this, but inflation happening these last few years.
Mm.
Um, a custom flute is starting now at around $11,000, but they can go up to, platinum. I think we had an order about a year ago looking at about $75,000. So it's,
$75,000.
yeah, yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? But that's what you're getting. It's like
I can buy a
jewelry.
GMC Yukon for that.
Oh, but it won't give you as much pleasure.
Oh man, that's amazing. So basically 11,000 to 65,000, 75,000
Yeah.
for custom level flutes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
Mhm. Yeah, and then we get to the Q series range, or what we want to call kind of pre-professional instruments. Um, that is starting at around $3,500 to the $4,000 range in between there, and goes to just under that $10,000 mark before you get into the customs. And then Amadeus, 1,400 to just under four.
Okay. So ed reps typically work with students who are in junior high and high school, maybe even going into college. What price ranges do you find are appropriate for those levels of students?
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at junior high and high school is a pretty large range, right? Of
Hmm.
the amount of skills that are acquired throughout those 7-8 years. So You're going to be looking at everything from your Amadeus flutes through your Q series flutes and those price ranges, and everything in between, right? So those price ranges are around $1,500 to could be up to $10,000 right before they
Hmm.
go off to college. It matters how serious the player is and how advanced they are, or what their goals are. I know that we're always talking about the qualifying questions; those are so important, right, for us as retail managers and ed reps. But just kind of finding out what are their aspirations with playing the flute, and so making sure that you're showing them the right flutes based on what their goals are, and staying within that price range as well. So so you're going to be looking for like the Amadeus line of flutes, which is 1,500 to just around under 4,000. You're going to be probably looking more at those are your middle school students, and maybe into maybe a little bit into high school, your freshman or sophomore. Again, this is just depending on what their price range is, what they're looking to invest. But then you should definitely, at least by high school, be getting them into a Q series flute. But there are times where
Hmm.
I've seen some really advanced middle schoolers hop right onto a Q series. So it just depends. Again, more on their goals and aspirations and
Okay.
playing level. Mhm.
And I would imagine they're private teachers, which is a topic I'd like to get into. So I remember in retail, if your student that you're working with has a private teacher, flute teachers seem to be quite involved, even more so than other instruments. Maybe violin is another comparable uh, teacher that's involved with the purchase of a nicer instrument when they're working with their students. Having been a flute teacher yourself, how involved did you get, and what's the process like when you're working with a student that you're trying to get into a better flute?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, let me just say how important, I mean, I think we all know, being in the industry, how important it is to have a private instructor, somebody to
Hmm.
guide you through how to really excel at the instrument. But yeah, to be that resource, to know what is out there. But, as ed reps, like, you are their resource as well. So it's super important for the reps to be in touch with those private teachers,
Hmm.
because a lot of private teachers, I'm not going to say who my private teacher was, and I hope she's not listening to this podcast right now. But but she wasn't really up to date on what was out there. And in the flute world, there are so many brands and so many options,
Hmm.
especially in this intermediate and pre-professional range. Um, so so she only gave me a couple models to try, and she told me to go to a flute shop, right? So I have a different mindset on it now, right? There are a lot of B&O stores that carry some of these wonderful high end flutes that make them really a specialty store. But in general, you got to win those private teachers over because they really want to feel taken care of. They want to feel special, and they're going to have a lot of influence on what these flutists, these flute students are buying.
So walk me through the process you would go through to help your students pick a flute.
So I would make sure that I was either sent 3 or 4 different brands, or I go to a store with the student to try out those brands. And I would make sure they're reputable, they're well known, in the industry. And then I would make sure that the student obviously has what they've been working on currently. I would walk them through, okay, let's make sure you warm up on your flute first, the one that you've been playing on for the last how many years. We get you all warmed up, and then we start introducing the flutes. And I make sure it's very, very structured, and that they're going to be playing, they're going to play a scale on it. They're going to play maybe 1 to 2 pieces or different sections from a piece. They're going to play something that is maybe that has a variety of different dynamics, a variety of articulations, but keeping it to 2 to 3 excerpts of something that demonstrate different dynamics, articulations, things like that, techniques. And then they go through the process, right, of trying. I would probably only bring in 2 flutes at a time. If you're exposed to too many, it can get really confusing.
Mm,
So,
yeah, I've heard that.
um, Yeah, so then we start the process of elimination, right? And we talk about, okay, what do you currently like about your flute that you were playing on? What do you not like about it, right? And then we start playing the new flutes that are being presented to us, and we have that conversation. What do you like? What are you hearing? This is what I'm hearing, and having that conversation. And then I'll even bring in the ed rep or some stranger from out in the hall and say, can you come in and listen? When we get down to maybe the final
Hmm.
two, and I'll even sometimes do a blind test, especially when you're in a store experience when maybe the teacher isn't there. It's always helpful. I really like to encourage the parent to be involved. A lot of parents are not musicians. Sometimes they've never even played an instrument before. And they like, no, I don't have an ear for sound. I'm like, no, you've heard American, you've watched American Idol before, right? You know what sounds good and what sounds bad. So I get them involved in the process, and then they feel more invested and they feel more comfortable. And yeah, so sometimes a blind test is really fun to do as well. And it's been really, yeah, really fun. It's a really fun
Okay.
process. Yeah.
Okay. So it sounds like something an ed rep could do to help with private teachers is just bring them flutes. Is that something that
Oh,
you,
yeah.
as a private teacher, would welcome?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my gosh, I was never visited by an ed. That's not true. That's how I got the job at Eastman. Actually, I feel like I was introduced to Scott Lehman. That's how I got to
Right.
know the rep at Eastman. He came into my flute studio trying to. So I don't want to say I never had an ed rep visit me, because we did, but. Yeah, it's always insightful to know what is out there. I had never heard of Eastman flutes before, and by meeting Scott, I was like, "Oh my gosh! Like, tell me more." I didn't know Eastman was the parent company of Haynes. So yeah, that
Hmm.
one-on-one, that personal relationship is so important. And again, like I can't tell you enough, flute teachers for the most part do not have the time and energy to research what is out there. And in the industry, like, we are coming out with new products all the time. It's hard
Hmm.
to stay up to date ourselves on what our competitors are doing. So it's important to really educate the teachers, and they will be appreciative of it, and have them give their feedback too. I loved when somebody would come to me and say, "Hey, will you try this flute out and give me your feedback?" Oh my gosh, I'm like, make them feel like an expert, because they are.
Hmm. Hmm.
So.
Yeah, good tip. I like that.
Mhm.
So I'm a trumpet player, and I remember working with flutists, and they would find out I'm a trumpet player, and they'd look at me like, "What do you know about flutes?" How do you, as a flutist, how do you think someone who's not a flutist working with you in a sales kind of capacity or helping someone pick out flutes? What are some tips you can give us non-flute players to work better with those who are flute players?
Yeah. I would say having a basic concept, and I mean extremely basic concept, of how to create a good flute sound. I would take that time, if you can, to just kind of watch 5 minutes of a lesson, either that be on YouTube, a beginning flute lesson, just so you know how the sound is
Hmm.
created. Um, because when they're not set up, again, we were talking about making sure they have plugs, making sure their hand position is correct. I don't know, just all these basic. They are really basic. You do not have to be a flute teacher to know how to make a good flute sound. And I think that's super important. When they feel comfortable, when they're putting this new instrument in their hands, they feel comfortable and they feel confident that they can play this higher level instrument and create a sound, and you coach them through that at least the first couple minutes and make them feel comfortable. That goes a long way, because
Hmm.
they're going to be playing with a full sound. I think encouraging them, okay, are you putting enough air into the instrument, right? Are you focusing that air into the flute and not blowing straight across like a pop bottle or Coke bottle, right? That's how I was taught
Hmm.
to play flute, and that is very much not correct. So,
Good to know.
just little tips of making sure the air is going more down into the flute, making sure that they're balancing that flute while they're feeling secure. And just talking them through the process, like, saying, hey, this flute that you're going to pick up, it's going to feel different than yours. And that's okay. It's supposed to. Having that dialogue with them and not being too overpowering, but just being, again, like, accessible and understanding of the process. So yeah, that's just a few tips. I think just making them feel comfortable.
So you don't have to be a flutist to work with flutists?
No, not at all, Shane. And you well, and I know that because I've sold violins, right, for 5 years. So I can you
Right,
don't have
right.
to be a you don't have to play the instrument. I think, there is a certain skill set like that I do have that makes me, I think be successful at my job, right? And but that the more time that you take to try and understand the flute world, the flute teachers, you're going to learn that, you're going to pick that up, and you're going to be able to convey that when you're
Hmm.
doing a trial or doing an in-house appointment at the shop. So yeah, so just be open and listen. Yeah.
Okay.
Hmm.
Yeah, I like that. Something I find that's unique in the flute world is the amount of flute associations that are at almost every state. You have a flute association. They have festivals. They have all of these get-togethers. You don't find that with a lot of other instruments. Can you talk about those associations and maybe how ed reps can grow some relationships with them?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so grateful we have so many. We're a group of people that really love coming together. Again, I think that's just based on, the history of flute. I mean, like we talked about this in the beginning. The flute was one of the first instruments ever made, the drum and the flute. And
Hmm.
so, I don't know. I'm a little biased, but I think it's the best instrument in the world. And I think obviously a lot of other people do too. And we love to come together and talk about its history. We love to talk about all the new things that are coming out, what the pedagogy of various our lineage of where we were, how we were taught, because the flute is so old, like teachers, we come from all different teachers from all over the world, and those pedagogies are really important to us. And so that's why we come together and we share our passion around our pedagogy and our playing and all the different exploratory sounds that we can create with the instrument. I mean, it's essentially just a tube, right, with holes, and so there's so many possibilities there. It's really fun to play with. So anyway, I'm super grateful that we have a community of flutists. Yeah, basically in every region or town there's a flute society. So my recommendation for ed reps is to get into those markets or into those communities and make yourself known. And again, just ask questions and listen and be open to learning more, and they will be inviting and accepting. I feel like flutists love to talk. So
Hmm.
yeah, and they love to talk about their instrument. Like I said, we have a passion. So just really connect with them and want to learn more. Be eager.
One thing I remember being an ed rep myself is having the Utah Flute Association,
Mm,
which was a really strong association in Utah. One thing I used to do is go to the yearly big flute day and
absolutely.
bring a whole booth full and fill it with flutes. Can you talk a little bit about those flute days? And I know they happen in lots of part of the countries. How can a music store and an ed rep get involved with those flute days? And what are some good things they can do for them?
Yeah, so you can obviously have a booth set up, bring a lot of flutes. If that year you just kind of want to scope out what it's like, I would definitely go in and make sure you wear your apparel and know who you're come from, and just make relationships, get to know the key teachers in the area, communicate, make yourself known to the board, and yeah, just start developing those relationships. Let them know about the services that you offer. Ask them, a lot of the time flutists are always trying to find good repair people. And so
Hmm.
letting them know about your repair department, asking them who do they go to for repairs, because they can be really finicky. Flutists are very scared to go to abandoned orchestra shop for their repair, because a lot of these flutes, they are finicky, right? They can be. These are
Hmm.
very they're very touchy, and they can get out of adjustment in shipping, or just going from getting on the bus and getting off the bus, and different temperatures. So repair and maintenance is super important. And so it's important, if you you do have a good repair department, or, just letting them know that and letting them know the background of your repair people, how experienced they are. And if they aren't as experienced, and maybe you're not getting a whole lot of higher end flute repairs coming in, or the teachers wanting to send their students to you, ask them why that is and try and improve that area, because I think that's an area where the stores could really thrive. I mean, flutists are trying to find good repair people everywhere. It's really hard. We ship our flutes all over the
Hmm.
country just to
Right.
certain specialists. Um, so yeah, that's one way. Other ways is making sure you have the sheet music that they want. I know sheet music is super easy to order online, but just to have it right there is good. So getting to know what their needs are, and making that available at your store or through you, and by making it your weekly visits.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Going back to the repair part, we had Rochelle Puccini on, a great violinist, in a different episode. And it's funny what you were saying about flutists and repair people. It's almost word for word of what she was talking about
Mm.
with violins and having great luthiers.
Mhm.
It sounds like the repair person can make or break the relationship with the flutist and the music store. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. That's all I'll say to that. I will also say that flutists are very much like violinists. We have specialty flute shops. They're not as many as there are violin shops throughout the country,
Hmm.
but we are similar in that we like certain things. We're very particular, and that's just from our voice in the orchestra. And I think, violinists, they are the soprano of the string section, right? And if you look at the wind section, we are the soprano of the winds. And we're very much soloists in our own regard. So our mindset is very similar to that of violinists, because our music is very similar.
Hmm.
So as a performer, I'm always listening to a lot of violinists to get musical ideas and phrasing and shaping. And so that is an instrument that we can relate a lot to. And so I think it's,
Hmm.
if you're trying to spruce up your wind sales, or your flute sales, excuse me, or maybe you're trying to add on a more higher end string shop onto your band and orchestra store, they'll go hand in hand. I think thinking of those two mindsets, they're very similar and relatable.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the best school music dealers out there have separate string shops.
Yeah.
And it's funny, you see the best flute salespeople, or music stores that, we consider school music dealers. They also have their own separate flute shop.
Shops. Yeah.
I guess that goes to show just how similar violinists and flutists really are. And
Absolutely.
the approach to them in the retail world is often very similar.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would, if you're working at a shop that does not have a specialty, flute shop or string shop, then I would try and make sure you hire a flute specialist, on your
Hmm.
staff. And I know that can be really tricky, because it's like, I need a specialist in every category, right? But
Right.
somebody that can really talk shop. It's not necessary. I was telling you kind of the things that you do need to know to be successful in the appointments. That little bit of research goes a long way. But if you're really trying to up your game, having a college student that is going for flute, or hiring somebody that is really a flute specialist, will be integral, really important.
Hmm. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. Again, similar advice to the violin world. Now,
Yeah,
imagine if your flute specialist is there at the store. They probably have a lot of connections in the flute world.
exactly. Hmm. Yep.
Yeah, good advice. Anything else, Corinne, that you want to tell us non-flute players out there about flute and how to do better with that category?
Oh man. Hmm. Have fun. Have fun with it. Everything that you guys are doing. I mean, I can't thank the ed rep audience that is listening enough, because I know where you've been. I'm in a position where now, with the Haynes Flute Company, it's quite unique. I started as I'm still a flutist today, but that was my trajectory, right, to become a professional flutist. And then I became an ed rep for a manufacturer, yes, but it's very similar to
Hmm.
what everybody else with the B&O store reps are doing. And just knowing your audience, and having fun doing it, doing the best that you can, doing the research, and connecting with people. That's how you become successful in your job. And it doesn't matter what instrument you're selling. So, and just
Hmm.
know that I'm always a resource for anybody. I think I'm very approachable, but I'm available at any time to anybody that wants to reach out. So, um, yeah.
What's the best way to get a hold of you?
Yeah, you can get a hold of me via email. My email is also on the William S. Haynes website, but my email is ksmith at wmshaynes.com. I won't give my phone number over the podcast, but for those of you
Understood.
that may know me, you're welcome to call or email me. I think my phone number may even be on the website. So but please, any trainings that I love giving trainings, right? I came from a teaching and playing background. So if you feel like your shop could use some specialty flute training, and get that, 5-6 minutes that you'll retain from an hour-long training that you just need for that to become a flute specialist for those in-house appointments, I'm happy to provide that for you. So please reach out. Do not be strangers. We are here as a resource for you.
Much appreciated, Corinne. Having sat through several trainings that you've done, I've learned a lot from you on flutes, and I know anybody who wants to learn more will certainly have a great resource in you.
Thank you so much, Shane.
Thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Shane. It's been a pleasure.
We hope you found the information in this episode useful and something you can use in your everyday life as an ed rep. If there is a topic you'd like to learn more about and have presented on a future episode of Ed Rep Radio, or you'd like to give us some feedback in general, please email us at edrepradio@eastmanstrings.com. To learn more about Eastman Music Company, go to our website, eastmanmusiccompany.com, or give your Eastman rep a call. Thanks, and drive safe.